See, people who believe that with the destruction of buildings, with the murder of people, they can somehow achieve a political purpose. They can destroy buildings, they can kill people, and we will be saddened by this tragedy, but they will never be allowed to kill the spirit of democracy. They cannot destroy our society. They cannot destroy our belief in the democratic way.
In a brief break in the day, firefighters could embrace each other, but it will be many hours before their work is done, and many years before the full story of what this day means is told. David Loyne, BBC News.
Catastrophe then for 4 civilian aircraft on the eastern seaboard of America. Fergus Walsh talks us through the sequence of events so far known.
It began in Boston when 2 passenger aircraft were hijacked by terrorists. These were United Flight 175 and American Airlines Flight 11, both bound for Los Angeles. They were forced to fly to the World Trade Center in New York. A third plane was hijacked at Washington Dulles Airport. That was American Airlines Flight 77, again bound for Los Angeles. It was flown to the Pentagon in Washington. A fourth aircraft, United Airlines Flight 93, from Newark to San Francisco, crashed southeast of Pittsburgh. Now, the World Trade Center in New York was the 4th tallest building complex in the world, 1,350 feet high. The Twin Towers dominated the skyline of Lower Manhattan. The first impact was just before 9 a.m. New York time, 2 p.m. here. The hijacked aircraft crashed into the 80th floor of the North Tower, each tower being 110 stories high. Now, 8 minutes later, a second plane crashed into the South Tower around the 65th floor. Now, the World Trade Center is the largest commercial complex in the world. It's effectively a mini-city. 50,000 people work inside. It has 90,000 visitors every day. The casualties inside and on the ground are unknown. What we do know is that American and United Airlines say the 4 aircraft involved had a total of 266 passengers and crew on board. Now, within an hour, the Twin Towers had collapsed. Now, unlike most conventional skyscrapers, which have lots of interior columns to give strength to the building, the exterior walls of the World Trade Center bore most of the load, so the direct attacks were enough to weaken the buildings and lead to their collapse. Now, let's turn to Washington. Within 45 minutes of the attacks on the World Trade Center, another hijacked plane had crashed in a direct hit on the Pentagon. One side of the 5-sided building was completely destroyed. Just over 30 minutes later, a car bomb exploded outside the State Department. Again, there's no figure on casualties. American fighters are now patrolling the skies above New York, Washington and other key locations to guard against further attacks. American military and government buildings across the world are on high alert. Other tall buildings in the US, such as the Sears Tower in Chicago, have been evacuated. America's day of horror is still unfolding.
Fergus Walsh there with some of the details. Well, reaction to the attacks on the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. have come from leaders around the world. Here's Geeta Gurumurthy.
Soon after the first explosions in New York, President Bush spoke of his shock and horror at the unfolding tragedy.
Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Worldwide, there was a sense of growing disbelief as thoughts turned to who was to blame. A Palestinian group, the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, denied initial reports that it was responsible.
We deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples.
But some in the Middle East were celebrating in the streets, here at Damascus Gate in Jerusalem. But the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat expressed his sympathies.
First of all, I am offering my condolences, the condolences of the Palestinian people to the American President Bush, to his government, to the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
The spiritual leader of Hamas said they didn't support the attacks, but they were the effects of America's policies of oppression.
America is reaping what it sows in oppression and implanting vengeance in the hearts of those who have been wronged by the oppression and corruption. However, in principle, we do not support attacks against civilians or innocents.
But across Europe, leaders like the British Prime Minister sent this warning to those responsible.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
Across the globe, governments are now tightening their security, fearful in the wake of such terror and carnage. Geeta Gurumurthy, BBC News.
Well, let's now go to New York City, where about 5.5 hours ago the horror began unfolding with this incident when a second plane flew in to the second of the World Trade Center towers. A first plane already having flown into the right hand of the towers. You can see there the damage and the smoke already billowing out. Well, let's now go live to New York City, to that location, to Jane Stanley, who's on the corner of 6th Avenue and Grand. Jane, we can see the smoke and the rubble and everything else behind you in the distance. What is happening now in South Manhattan?
Well, South Manhattan down here just behind me is effectively closed. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani made that announcement. He said that the downtown area of the city was closed, was to be evacuated. And to be honest, people were very, very willing to get out of it. I saw, as I was coming down here, people just walking, the pavements full, just trying to get as far away as possible. Though, of course, at some point later in the day, they're going to have to try to get home for the evening, and that's going to be incredibly difficult because this whole downtown area is the hub of many subway lines going into Brooklyn, into Queens. It's like a city that's completely in chaos, completely disrupted, doesn't know where it's at.
Now, the National Guard has already been mobilized by Rudy Giuliani, the mayor. What are the other implications for this enormous city, particularly the fact that the financial heart in Wall Street has essentially been ripped apart by these two explosions?
The implications are huge. This was the busiest area of Manhattan. 50,000 people, as we know, worked in the World Trade Center alone. Tens of thousands more in the areas around that. The Empire State Building, which is just behind me on this side, another huge building, has been evacuated. People, the whole area almost ground to a halt. You can probably hear yet another one of a stream of emergency vehicles, that one an ambulance constantly ferrying away from the area. It's an emergency scene. There's nothing else happening there, and I can't see much recovery very quickly. The damage here is enormous.
Jane, let's talk about the human side. You live in New York with our BBC colleagues. You're one of, what, 10 or 11 million people. What about the people around you you've seen who don't have a house at the moment, don't have anywhere to work, don't know what they're going to do? What's the state of shock?
It's awful.
Well, that's symptomatic of the communications difficulties we have with New York City, because many of the communication systems are actually connected via scanners and transmitters and receivers up on the top of the World Trade Center, including all the mobile phone systems. Well, let's now go to Heathrow Airport in London, because within the last few minutes, Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, has announced a number of what he said were draconian measures which he hoped would be understood by not just the British, but all international travellers. Robert, you're at Heathrow. Planes are moving around, but there is now almost a blanket being put on movements of planes.
Sorry, Nick, you timed that just as a plane took off. Try that one again.
Well, Tony Blair, a few minutes ago, inside Downing Street, was issuing a number of new regulations which sound very draconian, particularly indicating that there would be no flight paths over London.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that at this particular airport the prevailing wind is from the southwest, so and aircraft obviously take off and land into the wind, so a lot of the flights into here, this very, very busy airport, do take place across central London. A lot of the international viewers watching this will perhaps on a clear day have had that flight right in along the line of the River Thames. That clearly is going to stop. Mr. Blair and his colleagues in the emergency committee that met this afternoon have decided that they can't afford to take chances. There's also a heightened level of security, Nick, here. We're seeing more patrols in the airport terminals. As you can tell from the sirens behind me, there are have also been, as we've been here, a significantly heightened number of security alerts. That sense of alert, that sense of awareness of the dangers that may now face other parts of the world felt very keenly here.
Now, Robert, we're hearing you well, by the way, with those planes taking off. What do you think we should read into these measures that the British government has just announced? No flights over London, no small private planes being allowed to take off anymore, all defence facilities now on the highest state of alert.
I think what's happening here is probably being repeated around the world, Nick. Anybody who considers themselves that to be a target will now be taking similar precautions. It's going to mean, conceivably, extensive disruption. As airlines are already suffering here, I mean, we've now got airliners, Nick, on the way back in here that got to just under halfway across the Atlantic and had just enough fuel to come back. And once the US airports, the Canadian airports shut down, those aircraft were told to turn around. Those passengers have begun arriving here this evening. Other aircraft that had just gone across the halfway line were allowed to touch down at the nearest airport on the other side of the Atlantic. Considerable disruption. That's just the UK-based airports. You can be sure that that sort of disruption is spreading around the world. All those flights destined for the United States and to Canada, at least as long as those airports are closed, will face that disruption. And even if they reopen the airports, aircraft and crews and resources will be in the wrong place. But frankly, I think the atmosphere here, is fair to say, is that given the scale of the calamity, the scale of the tragedy in the United States, people in the UK airports are willing to put up with that disruption for the time being.
Robert Hall, thanks for joining us live from Heathrow. An indication there of what is now facing every air traveller, certainly in the Western world, after what has happened on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Indicative there of the speed at which other governments have been reacting, and I can read right across the board reaction across the European Union well beyond. In other words, every single country now taking this as an extraordinary wake-up call for international air security, particularly the responsibility of the security of getting people on planes. Now, our diplomatic editor, Brian Hanrahan, has joined me. Brian, we were hearing a very somber Tony Blair 5 hours after what has happened in America, talking about standing shoulder to shoulder with America until this evil is removed. But what should we read into the fact that there will be no flight paths now over London?
That is, I think, the immediate precaution, that they do not wish to see a similar event occurring here in London. In other words, they're worried that if planes fly over London, they might just crash onto a building or other in London and repeat what has happened in New York or in Washington. So I think that's, if you like, an elementary precaution, given that there are some suggestions that the original security alert, which we heard a few days ago, did include the idea that Britain might also be a target along with America.
Now, what is your assessment then of who really is in the target sites of those who may have done this in America?
At this point, it really can only be speculation, but the speculation is starting to come out of the United States. We have a senior FBI official, I believe it is, but it's a senior security official, suggesting that those associated with Osama bin Laden, the Saudi millionaire who's a fugitive in Afghanistan and has been accused by the United States in the past of funding and arranging terrorist attacks against it, most notably the bombing of the African embassies in 1998. Now, that has a particular interest, the fact that's been said, is because last month a court in the United States claimed that Osama bin Laden had now formed an alliance with a group of Algerian-based terrorists, and that these people had been trained with his money, had gone to work with him in his camps, and he had been cooperating with them. And at the time, a number of experts said this alliance is extremely serious, because what it does is it spreads the base. This was a man who previously had been effectively contained in Afghanistan, was very rich, but actually lacking perhaps in operatives. Now, by forming alliance with the groups of other people, and they've suggested that they would include Tunisians, Libyans and Moroccans, who have all been into the camps that he runs in Afghanistan, that by giving them help and helping them to carry out attacks against their targets, he is in a position to call them back and say, now we need your help. I need your help in order to launch my attack against the United States. And that would perhaps account for the extraordinary sophistication and wide-ranging ability which is involved in this attack here. What we've got is suicide airline pilots, people who can fly planes and are willing to kill themselves in order to serve the cause. That's not the normal pattern of suicide bombers. So these are people who are entirely different from those we've dealt with in the past.
Is there a danger, Brian, of rushing to judgment and rushing to conclusions, given what happened with Timothy McVeigh in Oklahoma City? Yes. Everyone said the Middle East there. They did.
That's the obvious danger, and I think there'll be a certain caution about it. But if you recall what happened after there are court indictments against Osama bin Laden on the question of the Nairobi bombing. America will say that it does have the judicial position to move in and look for him and possibly attack him. Certainly we know that they launched cruise missile attacks against him in the past, and I suspect that if they believe that he is involved in this, then they'll be prepared to do at least that much again.
And diplomatically, is there a real fear that it's not just America that's actually a target at the moment?
Well, I think diplomatically there is a fear that other people associated with America could be in the frame, and if they could be targeted, would be. I suspect that practically it would be, if there are resources to attack, they would be used against the United States, and that what we might see is a backlash or copycat attacks. I think the major fear around the world will be either there is a second wave, or much more likely there will be people who say, if one person can do it, why don't we all have a go? And that's the danger.
Brian Hanrahan, our diplomatic editor, thanks for joining us. Well, let's now build on what Brian was saying there about the FBI and international partners already trying to work out who could be capable of planning attacks on this scale. Here's our diplomatic correspondent, James Robbins.
In the Arab quarter of Jerusalem, they're celebrating the massacre and mayhem in the United States. What's a disaster to much of the world is seen as a triumph by some. It's evidence of how much hatred has already been refueled by this disaster. Now American intelligence, which missed stopping the attacks, will desperately be searching for the culprits. And to find who's behind it, they'll first ask, how was it done?
I think it's almost impossible to believe that a hijacker could convince an American domestic airline pilot to commit suicide by flying into the World Trade Center. I have absolutely no doubt at all they had trained pilots. We know in the past that they've had pilots who have been perfectly capable of flying aircraft, and this can only be the only, I think, answer to this. American pilots would not do this, but Arab fundamentalists may well be prepared to.
Number one suspect has got to be this man, Osama bin Laden, the richest and possibly the most ruthless terrorist in the world. Bin Laden has declared the destruction of the United States his top priority. He heads and pays for an extraordinary international network of Islamic militants. Whatever the response, Osama bin Laden is already accused by the United States of bombing 2 of its embassies in Africa in 1998. 224 people were killed, including 12 Americans. It's only 3 months now since 4 Islamic extremists were convicted of those bombings by a court sitting in New York. Osama bin Laden was named by American federal prosecutors as the mastermind of these killings and a string of other attacks. Bin Laden is also suspected of involvement in this previous attack on today's major target, the World Trade Center. This bombing in 1993 killed 6 people and blew a 60-foot hole through 4 basement levels of the building. And this evening, many Palestinian and other Islamic militant organizations are distancing themselves from today's attacks, Perhaps they're fearful of American retaliation. A leading Middle East analyst in Britain hopes the blame won't fall on the entire Arab world.
It will stigmatize many, many innocent people, law-abiding people who have settled in the West. But what can states do? You've got to be practical.
Before today, the worst terrorist attack inside the United States was the Oklahoma bombing of 1995. And it was an American, Timothy McVeigh, who was convicted and executed for that mass killing. But tonight, nobody seriously believes Americans have been killing their own. And the mastermind for these latest attacks is being sought outside America's borders. James Robbins, BBC News.
So what of President George Bush's determination now? He was in Florida when the first incidents began. He then flew to Louisiana at an Air Force base. He promised to hunt down and punish those responsible for the attacks.
Freedom itself was attacked this morning by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended. I want to reassure the American people that the full resources of the federal government are working to assist local authorities to save lives and to help the victims of these attacks. Make no mistake, the United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts. I've been in regular contact with the Vice President, Secretary of Defense, the National Security Team, and my cabinet. We have taken all appropriate security precautions to protect the American people. Our military at home and around the world is on high alert status, and we have taken the necessary security precautions to continue the functions of your government. We have been in touch with the leaders of Congress and with world leaders to assure them that we will do whatever is necessary to protect America and Americans. I ask the American people to join me in saying a thanks for all the folks who have been fighting hard to rescue our fellow citizens, and to join me in saying a prayer for the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested, but make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
Well, what are the options now for the United States? George Joffe, Middle East expert, has joined me. George, you heard the President say there, make no mistake, the US will hunt down and punish those responsible. When you look at what has happened, a handful of people on 4 planes, who are they going to look for?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because there may only have been a handful of people, but they were on 4 planes, and that required 4 pilots. It required backup crews, all prepared to sacrifice themselves for the sake of hitting these targets. Now, the real question, it seems to me, is whether or not the groups that are the obvious targets, particularly bin Laden, have the skills necessary and could have got through American airport security to get on the planes themselves. My fear is that the Americans will take the shortcut to assuming that it is bin Laden, and they will therefore try to attack bases connected with him or even he himself.
Now, they've done this before, after the 2 attacks on the embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam 3 years ago, and they had a very high-profile attack in Khartoum with cruise missiles. Did they hit the right targets?
They certainly didn't. They then hit a chemical factory that they claim was involved, and they destroyed it. The owner demonstrated that he was not connected to bin Laden and actually sued the United States for compensation, which he in fact obtained. They also attacked camps inside Afghanistan, but they certainly didn't hit bin Laden.
So the Americans have now admitted, or conceded essentially, that they hit the wrong target, because they claim that bin Laden had been using that factory and they found traces in the drainage ducts.
I'm afraid they didn't concede that. The case is not yet decided. They are still denying that in fact it was the wrong target. So there are certainly going to be great problems over the United States admitting that it should have made a mistake of this kind.
Now, we had the USS Cole last year. Are there fingerprints? Are there email traces? Are there electronic traces? Are there paper traces? Is there a trail of any kind which does inevitably lead to one person?
No, there aren't. And one of the problems is a question of coordination between the security services of different states. Both in Saudi Arabia over the Al-Khobar bombing and in Yemen over the USS Cole bombing, the local authorities resented very much the presence of the FBI, and there was as a result a lot of friction. So the evidence was never fully exchanged. And in fact, in the case of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabia government rejected the American claims of an Iranian involvement, and in the case of Yemen, the Yemeni authorities found their own criminals, who they then tried themselves. So we don't know whether in those previous cases there were proper electronic traces.
You seem to be suggesting that you have fears that America will respond in a very decisive way without necessarily the evidence to back up the reason for hitting the targets they're likely to hit.
I fear that could be the case. It's tended to be the case in the past. Now, on this occasion, there are already hints from the United States that American officials are saying that there are indications that bin Laden was involved, and we know from a London source that Arab sources believe that bin Laden was planning a spectacular attack on the United States. But that's very flimsy evidence on which to move forward.
But I have to say, sitting there was Stephen Simon 3 hours ago, who used to be in the counter-terrorism department at the White House, and he was saying they did foil a mass attack on 12 jumbo jets over the Pacific, which they traced back to bin Laden.
Well, I'm sure they foiled such an attack. We don't know the details of the way in which the tracings were carried out. And one needs to be very careful over these things. There have been a series of arrests, for example, in Europe, and extradition proceedings back to the United States, some of which have not succeeded because the evidence was too flimsy. And then we have the classic example of the Lockerbie case, where American evidence there was shown to be completely wanting, with the result that one of the defendants was actually found not guilty.
Do you feel uneasy, even talking like this 5.5 hours, 6 hours after the event, given what happened in Oklahoma City with Timothy McVeigh? Everyone immediately looked to the Middle East.
Yes, I do feel very uncomfortable. And I have to say that although there appear to be strong pressures indicating the Middle East, I still don't feel convinced. One of the reasons is that this attack originated on American territory. It required people to penetrate American security in a country that is acutely sensitive about the Middle East. And it required also enormous coordination. I find that really very difficult to understand.
We now have new images from downtown New York City, looking almost as if a typhoon or hurricane has hit the place, and one can only imagine the most appalling kind of wind and horror. I mean, it looks like a nuclear attack. But let's remember that, was it 5 years ago, that there was a similar attack on the World Trade Center, and the trail has already led to courtrooms, which has led to bin Laden, hasn't it?
Oh yes, there was a similar attack. Whether it led to bin Laden or not is not quite certain. It's a little more complicated, I think. The fact was then, though, that the attack was much less sophisticated. It consisted of using chemical fertilizers as a means of making the explosives in a van that was parked in a car park. Now, that had a devastating effect, but it was nowhere near as complex as the attacks today.
But what about the fact that in a lower Manhattan courtroom, there you had several people who were incriminated for the Nairobi and Dar es Salaam bombings, not all of them, but some of them, and in the end, bin Laden kept being mentioned, and here you have New York City being targeted.
Yes. If you're looking for connections in terms of past attacks, certainly you can find connections to the Middle East. They're not necessarily directly to bin Laden. They may be to groups associated with him, particularly to the Jamiat Islamiyah, which was in fact the group said to be behind the World Center bombings last time.
George, we have to stop there because Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York City, is speaking at this moment.
Coordination with the federal government from the time of the first attack has been excellent, including closing off the airspace around Manhattan and doing everything that can possibly be done in the face of this barbaric act to make the city secure. And we will strive now very hard to save as many people as possible and to send a message that the city of New York and the United States of America is much stronger than any group of barbaric terrorists, that our democracy, that our rule of law, that our strength and our willingness to defend ourselves will ultimately prevail. And I'd ask the people of New York City to do everything that they can to cooperate, not to be frightened, to go about their lives as normal. Everything is safe right now in the city, and the
people who are doing the relief effort need all the help they can get. And then, Governor, thank you very much for your assistance and your help and your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, for your leadership through this crisis. This is a vicious attack upon New York. It's an attack upon America. It's an attack upon the whole concept of freedom and our way of life. And we cannot let these attacks succeed. The first step has to be to make sure we do everything in our power to protect the people and to save the lives of those whose lives are still at risk and to help those who have been injured. And I want to commend the mayor, and I want to thank my colleagues from Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the federal government have all offered and made ready support to help us deal with this ongoing crisis. The people of New York are not only the freest and most diverse people in the world, we're also, I believe, the most capable of rising to meet the challenges of this type of attack. And right now we want New Yorkers to remain calm, to go about their business, to appreciate the fact that everything to provide for their safety is being done, to appreciate that everything that can be done to provide for the health and the needs of the people who are still at risk is being done, and that we will continue to work to make sure that we get through this as strongly and quickly as possible. I want to thank the federal administration. Secretary Thompson has been on the phone with me a number of times, as well as the President, for what they are offering and prepared to do. And we're just confident that, while this is a horrible attack and one that is despicable and really unthinkable in its magnitude, we will get through this, and we will continue to have a great and free country, state, and society.
Do we know the number of casualties at this point, sir?
I don't think we really want to speculate about that. The number of casualties will be more than any of us can bear ultimately, and I don't think we want to speculate on the number of casualties. The effort now has to be to save as many people as possible. And I don't think we will know the answer to that until sometime tomorrow or the next day.
Were there large numbers of firefighters?
There are a large number of firefighters and police officers who are in harm's way, and we don't know how many we've lost. But there's no doubt we've lost some firefighters and police officers.
Do you know anything about the cause of the explosions that brought the two buildings down yet? Was it caused by the planes or by something else? We believe that it was caused by the after effects of the planes hitting the buildings. We don't know of an additional explosion after that. Could you tell us, do you expect any further attacks on New York? Is there anything to indicate that there could be more bombs, more planes out there? I know originally there was a report that 8 planes had been hijacked, 4 have only been accounted for. What about the remaining 4? And is there any possibility that there could be bombs on the ground planted by...
We have no specific information to that effect. Obviously, the city is now closed. The airspace around the city is closed, and we are on heightened alert. But we have no specific information suggesting any further attack.
Can you tell us where the planes came from? Coming into the port of New York right
I think to give the people of New York confidence, to show that the federal government is standing with us, and to just to make certain that nothing further happens. This has been a very, very difficult and traumatic day for the people of the United States and the people of the city. And I think that it's an act that shows that the federal government is going to do everything they can to support us and help us.
Can you give us an idea of the extent of the rescue effort that's going on right now in Lower Manhattan? The scope of this operation?
There are over 1,000 rescue workers, probably about 2,000 that are deployed, trying to get into the buildings, trying to find people, trying to search for people. The governor and I spoke a couple of hours ago, and the governor has deployed the National Guard to relieve them because our people are going to need reinforcements pretty soon. But right now they don't want to leave because they're searching for innocent citizens, and they're searching for some of their brothers and sisters.
Are you finding survivors?
Yes, we have some numbers that we can give you. We have 1,500 people at Liberty State Park who were evacuated, described as walking wounded. They were evacuated by ferry and other means. There are about 600, as of about 15 minutes ago, in local hospitals that we account for. 600 people that are being treated in local hospitals. And there are 150 in particular that were critical, that were moved by EMS. New York City has 170 hospitals. So we have a lot of hospitals, and we're utilizing all of them. Probably the one that was the hardest hit was St. Vincent's Hospital. And I would like to just single them out and commend them,
because as I was rushing down there after the first plane hit and before the second, they were already deploying people on the street. I could see the doctors and nurses outside getting ready to receive people. And that was before the second plane actually hit the World Trade Center.
What was your experience down there?
Also blood donations. We have several sites for blood donations. 153 East 53rd Street, 66th in Amsterdam, which is the Red Cross, and 310 East 67th Street. If people want to do something and they can donate blood, that's going to help not just today, but tomorrow and the next day. This relief effort is going to take some time.
Mr. Mayor, you were one of the first people down there. Can you describe the scene in your own words, what you saw down there?
I don't know that I'm really able to describe it. It was the most horrific scene I've ever seen in my whole life. We saw the World Trade Center in flames, a big gaping hole all the way on the top of it. We could see people jumping from the top of the building. And then we went into Barclay Street, 75 Barclay Street, I think it was, and we were there when the building collapsed, and it collapsed in part on 75 Barclay Street. So we were trapped in the building for maybe 10 or 15 minutes, trying to get out different exits. And we finally went through a basement and came out 100 Park Place.
Did you ever fear for your own safety, sir?
Sure, yeah.
What went through your mind?
I don't think anything went through my mind other than making sure that we all remained calm and found an exit and just tried to figure out the most intelligent thing to do. Probably the same thing that went through the minds of 10,000 other New Yorkers who I could see on the streets, and I really have to commend them. If you really want to know what New Yorkers are all about, you just watch the way in which they handle themselves. They didn't panic. They moved deliberately. They moved swiftly. But they didn't hurt each other. They helped each other. I mean, these are just the most wonderful people in the world.
Do we know anything about the composition of that dust that blankets lower Manhattan? Is there any asbestos or any hazardous material in that dust?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that.
Mr. Mayor, there was a gas explosion related to this, as far as you were aware of that? There was a gas leak or possible exposure.
We don't believe it. We don't believe that's the case.
Mr. Mayor, can you tell us anything about where the planes come from, where the aircraft came from?
Bill Diamond reminds me that we've turned off the gas in the city buildings, just to be certain.
Can you tell us
as a precaution
about where these aircraft came from? There was a report they may have been hijacked in Boston.
I think we should leave. I think we should leave that up to the federal government to yes, we do have some information, but I think we should leave that up to the federal government to release that information. Our focus is on the relief efforts. And
Governor, do you think there should be any retaliation on the part of the United States for what happened here in this country, both in New York, Washington, and other places?
First step right now, Marcia, is to make sure we do everything to help those people who need our support, and whether they're injured or still trapped in buildings. The second thing is to make sure at the same time we're providing the maximum security against possible additional incidents. But clearly, this is an attack upon America. It's an attack upon our freedom and our way of life, and we must retaliate and go after those who perpetuated this heinous crime against the people of America.
Mayor, this has been compared to Pearl Harbor. Do you consider this to be an act of war? This has been compared.
I'll do both.
This has been compared to Pearl Harbor. Do you consider this to be an act of war?
This is a vicious, unprovoked, horrible attack on innocent men, women, and children. It's one of the most heinous acts certainly in world history. And as the governor said, and I said to the president, we fully and completely support him in any action that he has to take in order to make an example out of the people who are responsible for this.
Is it an act of war in your mind?
I don't know that I want to use those words. I think the president is the one that has to respond, and I think what he has to know is that all of us in New York support him, and support him completely in the efforts that he's going to have to make over the next couple of days, week, and to make a point that that people can't do this. You can't attack innocent men, women, and children. And ultimately, I'm totally confident that American democracy and the American rule of law will prevail. And the people of New York are going to help to demonstrate that over the next couple of days.
How many anybody take responsibility for this? Any group take responsibility at this time? And what is the city doing to safeguard the citizens now that something like this happens?
Well, first of all, I don't know of anyone that's taken responsibility for it at this time. And secondly, the New York City Police Department is fully deployed, not just in the rescue effort, but all throughout the city of New York, offering as much protection and as much security as we're capable of for the citizens of the city. And at this point, I believe that the people in New York City can demonstrate our resolve and our support for all of the people that were viciously attacked today by going about their lives and showing everyone that vicious, cowardly terrorists can't stop us from being a free country and a place that functions. And we'll do everything we can to make that point.
Jennifer Steinhauer, please.
Just a housekeeping. Can you please tell us what's going to happen to the New York primary?
This morning I issued an order suspending the primary across the state. There will be no primary today, and we'll reschedule it once we get through this.
Jennifer, please.
Can you please walk us through the municipal services right now, what's going on with the subways and the schools, the courts?
The subway, the schools, the Chancellor, I commend the Chancellor. He was on the phone a number of times with us. He coordinated very, very carefully what would happen. He thought it out, and he came up with a very good plan, which was essentially to keep the schools open, to keep the children in school, so we didn't have a large number of children in the different boroughs that would be released from school. They're being released, I shouldn't say as normal, but basically on the normal schedule. If parents aren't there to pick up the young children, then the children will be taken to a center, and the parents will be notified to come and pick them up. The children who have Metro cards, who normally travel on the subway, will be able to do that. The subways are functioning in 4 of the 5 boroughs, and can we get an update, Joe, on how the subway is doing in Manhattan?
All the lettered lines are working.
And in Manhattan?
In Manhattan lines, all the lettered lines.
All the lettered lines are working, including in Manhattan, and throughout the rest of the city, public transportation is normal. So the children should be able to return from school in the normal fashion. And if any children don't have parents to pick
That's
them up...
Rudy Giuliani, the mayor of New York City, speaking live with George Pataki, who's the governor of New York State. Hearing the very human response in New York City, the real challenge now for the many millions of people who are living in New York City and right up into New York State